Morning inspection of the East Gallery was usually silent, predictable. As Royal Guard Lieutenant Arman passed the display cases, he noticed a strip of pale fabric caught behind a carved pedestal, too small to belong to any uniform, frayed as if torn in haste. The cleaning staff had not logged anything unusual. Armand stopped, studying the cloth, aware that something in the palace routine had quietly gone wrong. The gallery wing was unusually still that morning, the kind of stillness Arman had learned to notice, not because of what was present, but because of what was absent. The faint echo of footsteps normally carried along the marble corridor during early inventory rounds, and distant voices from curators or attendants usually softened the silence. Today, the air felt sealed, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Arman stood near the eastern display hall, examining the velvet rope barrier that had been disturbed during the night's rotation. It was a minor irregularity, the sort that rarely demanded more than a notation, yet something about the angle of the post drew his attention downward. Near the base, partially hidden against the polished floor, lay a small fabric object, a child's glove, pale blue, finely stitched, unmistakably belonging to someone young. The palace maintained strict movement records, especially concerning younger members of the household. Children did not wander unsupervised, and they were never scheduled in the gallery wing during inventory hours. Arman crouched, lifting the glove carefully, noting the faint crease where it had been compressed, as though stepped on or dropped in haste. The marble beneath felt cold through the thin sole of his boot, the air cooler here than in the adjacent corridors, a result of controlled humidity for the artifacts. He rose slowly, scanning the long corridor. The lights overhead glowed steady and white, illuminating portraits and display cases in an unbroken line, each shadow sharp and deliberate. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Still holding the glove, Arman keyed his radio but did not transmit. Routine procedure required immediate reporting of unidentified personal items in restricted wings, yet protocol also emphasized discretion when matters might involve members of the royal household. An alarm, even a minor one, could ripple outward quickly, drawing staff, aides, and administrators into speculation before facts were known. He turned instead toward the control alcove at the end of the hall, issuing a quiet instruction to the nearest posted guard to seal the gallery under routine authority, citing an inventory discrepancy. The wording was deliberate, neutral, unlikely to provoke attention. Within minutes, the heavy doors at both ends of the wing were secured, and the corridor returned to silence. Inside the alcove, Arman began reviewing entry logs from the morning rotation. The system recorded each authorized badge crossing, each scheduled cleaning crew, each curator assigned to inspect the exhibits. He moved methodically through the timestamps, his eyes adjusting to the glow of the monitor in the dim control space. Names appeared in orderly sequence: guards, maintenance, 2 conservators, but there was no record of a child, nor any escort assigned to bring one through the wing. He checked again, scrolling back an additional hour, then another. Nothing. The absence itself carried weight. In a palace governed by record and routine, something that left no trace often mattered more than something that did. Arman leaned back slightly, the chair creaking faintly beneath him, and looked again at the glove resting on the desk. The fabric was clean, except for a faint gray smear near the fingertips, like dust or residue from a surface not usually touched by children. He felt the first quiet stir of unease, not sharp, not urgent, but steady and persistent, like a draft slipping under a closed door. Arman began widening the scope of his review, pulling records from adjacent corridors and cross-checking staff assignments. The palace's internal movement system was precise by necessity. Every shift change, every rotation, every cleaning cycle followed a predictable rhythm. He noted the cleaning crew scheduled to pass near the gallery at mid-morning, but their route logs showed no deviation, no entry into the wing itself. He accessed maintenance records, looking for any scheduled inspection that might explain a child being escorted through the area, yet the calendar was clear. The more he searched, the more the absence of explanation began to form a pattern of its own. He stood and stepped back into the corridor, the quiet pressing against his ears. The sealed doors at either end of the wing remained closed, their brass handles reflecting the overhead lights. He walked slowly along the display cases, not searching for anything specific, but allowing his senses to guide him. The air carried a faint metallic scent, subtle enough that another guard might have ignored it, but Arman had learned to trust small impressions. Near one of the tall glass cases, he noticed a faint smudge at child height on the polished surface, as if a hand had steadied itself there. He placed his own gloved fingers near the mark without touching it, measuring the height instinctively. It aligned with the size of the glove. A child had been here, and not calmly. The smear suggested movement, imbalance, perhaps urgency. He straightened, his gaze moving down the length of the corridor toward the narrow archway leading to a service passage rarely used except for maintenance staff. That passage lay beyond the normal patrol route, and while it remained locked, its presence connected the gallery to deeper sections of the palace. Protocol required that any irregularity involving restricted movement be reported immediately to the senior security office. Arman knew the procedure by memory, every step clear, every escalation defined, yet he hesitated. If a vulnerable member of the household had passed through here, triggering a formal alarm without understanding the circumstances could cause confusion, or worse, expose the child to attention and speculation before the situation was understood. Discretion was also a duty, though less clearly written. Arman returned to the control alcove and began compiling a quiet internal report, marking it preliminary and limiting its circulation to a narrow internal channel. It was a calculated delay, not negligence but judgment, and he felt the weight of it settle on him as he worked. Outside, somewhere beyond the sealed doors, faint footsteps echoed and faded, ordinary palace life continuing, unaware of the small disturbance contained within this silent wing. Arman closed the log file and looked once more at the glove on the desk. The fabric seemed smaller now under the stark light, fragile, out of place in the controlled order of the gallery. He reached for his radio, intending to request a discreet cross-check of adjacent camera feeds, when the monitor beside him flickered briefly, the image stuttering for less than a second before stabilizing again, and in that instant of distortion, Arman felt the unease sharpen into something colder, the sense that whatever had brought the child here was not yet finished. The brief flicker on the monitor lasted less than a second, yet Arman continued staring at the screen long after the image stabilized. Years of duty had trained him to recognize the difference between harmless technical imperfections and disturbances that carried intent. Palace surveillance systems were designed with redundancies layered so carefully that even a minor glitch triggered an automatic notation in the system log. He moved the cursor to the timeline and began scrolling backward, isolating the feed covering the gallery corridor. The digital clock in the corner advanced in steady increments, the corridor remaining empty, silent, unchanged, until the timestamp abruptly skipped. 4 minutes disappeared without transition, the recording resuming as though nothing had occurred. Arman leaned closer, adjusting the playback speed, replaying the segment twice, then a third time, confirming the absence was real and not a loading error. The system log appeared alongside the footage, and a notation marked the interruption as a routine reset. That explanation might have satisfied a casual observer, but Arman knew the reset schedule as well as he knew the patrol routes. Maintenance windows were always announced in advance, always documented in multiple channels to prevent precisely this kind of uncertainty. He opened the maintenance calendar and scanned the entries for the day. No reset had been authorized. The quiet in the control alcove deepened as the implication settled. A 4-minute absence in a corridor where a child's glove had been found could not be dismissed as coincidence. Arman accessed the broader network log, tracing the system's internal commands. Each authorized reset carried a digital signature tied to a specific technician's credentials. The entry attached to this reset was incomplete, the identification field partially blank, as though the command had been initiated from an internal terminal bypassing normal authentication layers. That detail disturbed him more than the missing footage itself. It suggested familiarity with the system, knowledge of its blind points, and confidence that the absence might go unnoticed. He felt the pressure of decision begin to build, subtle but persistent. Reporting upward immediately would bring investigators, administrators, and layers of inquiry that moved methodically but slowly. Yet delaying meant assuming responsibility for information that could indicate deliberate concealment. He rested his hands on the edge of the desk, feeling the cool metal beneath his palms, and forced himself to continue examining the evidence rather than reacting to the implications. The corridor on the screen remained still, the polished floor reflecting the steady lights, giving no sign that 4 minutes of reality had been erased from record. Then, as he adjusted the timeline once more, he noticed something else. A faint shift in lighting at the moment the footage resumed, as though a door somewhere beyond the camera's frame had just closed. Arman isolated the frames immediately after the interruption and magnified the far end of the corridor, where the passage curved toward the service archway. The image resolution degraded under magnification, but subtle details emerged. A faint blur near the edge of the frame, low to the ground, disappearing out of sight within 2 seconds. It was too small to be an adult and too brief to identify clearly, yet its movement was hurried, unsteady. He replayed the segment repeatedly, studying the motion, the way the shadow shifted against the base of the wall, the slight tremor in the camera's automatic exposure as something passed close to the lens, just outside the visible angle. A child moving quickly, perhaps being guided or pulled, perhaps running. The absence of sound made the moment feel even colder. Surveillance removed the human presence from events, leaving only silent evidence, and silence often concealed urgency more effectively than noise. Arman opened the staff rotation records corresponding to the missing 4 minutes. Cleaning personnel had been scheduled to pass through the outer corridor at precisely that time, their route bringing them within badge range of the gallery entrance, but not inside it. He cross-checked their individual movement logs. Each badge showed normal progression, no irregular entries, no pauses long enough to account for a reset. If one of them had accessed an internal terminal, it would have required additional authorization or assistance. The possibility of internal access hardened into probability. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, and looked again at the glove lying on the desk. The small smear of dust on its fabric seemed more significant now, as though it carried a trace of the unseen minutes. Palace security doctrine emphasized layered trust. Staff were vetted, movements recorded, access segmented. Yet no system was immune to misuse by someone who understood its structure. Arman felt the quiet weight of responsibility pressing more heavily than before. The matter had moved beyond a misplaced object or an unsupervised child. It now suggested intention, planning, and a willingness to manipulate official records. He reached for his radio, intending to request a discreet technical audit, then paused, his thumb resting against the transmit switch. Escalation would set formal procedures in motion, and once begun, they could not be contained or reversed. If a vulnerable member of the household was involved, discretion remained essential.
He set the radio down without speaking and instead began tracing the physical layout of the gallery wing on the digital floor plan, following the corridors that lay just beyond the camera's reach. One route drew his attention immediately, a narrow service passage behind the eastern wall, seldom used, connecting the gallery to a section of private family quarters rarely patrolled except during scheduled inspections. Arman studied the passage on the screen, the thin line of its path disappearing into restricted space, and felt the unease sharpen into certainty that whatever passed through the corridor during those missing 4 minutes had not been moving aimlessly, but toward somewhere deliberate.
Arman stood in front of the digital floor plan for several seconds without moving, memorizing the narrow service passage that ran behind the gallery wall. He had walked that corridor only twice in his career, both times during scheduled inspections accompanied by a supervisor, and he remembered its character clearly. Low ceilings, exposed pipes painted in dull enamel, lighting spaced too far apart, leaving intervals of shadow between pale cones of illumination. It was not a place anyone entered without purpose. Protocol regarding the passage was unambiguous. Entry required written authorization, and any unscheduled access demanded immediate reporting to Central Command. The rule existed not only to protect the privacy of the private family quarters it connected to, but also to ensure that movements near those quarters were always known and controlled. Arman understood the reasoning, and he had enforced that boundary many times. Yet the memory of the glove on the desk and the silent 4-minute gap in the footage pressed against those rules, creating a tension that felt less like doubt and more like urgency held in restraint. He left the control alcove and walked the length of the sealed gallery corridor once more, this time observing the walls rather than the displays. Near the eastern end, partially concealed behind a decorative panel designed to blend with the architecture, lay the maintenance access door to the service passage. It appeared undisturbed at first glance, the painted surface unmarked, the handle aligned precisely as it should be. But as Arman drew closer, he noticed a faint irregularity along the lower edge, a thin line of abrasion on the marble where the door had been opened wider than usual, scraping dust from the floor that routine cleaning would normally remove. He crouched, running a gloved finger lightly across the surface. The dust was fresh, disturbed within hours, not days. Rising, he examined the handle. The metal felt colder than the surrounding air, a subtle but perceptible difference suggesting recent contact. Arman straightened and looked back down the silent corridor, listening. The sealed doors at either end held firm, and the only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system, circulating cool air through hidden vents. No footsteps approached, no voices carried. He was alone with the decision. Entering the passage without authorization would constitute a breach of protocol, even if done in good faith. The rule existed to prevent precisely that kind of unilateral action, to ensure that no guard acted beyond the boundaries of defined authority. Yet protocol also required the protection of vulnerable members of the household above all else, and that principle, though less precisely worded, carried equal weight. Arman placed his hand on the handle and paused, feeling the quiet pressure of responsibility settle into his chest. Then he turned the handle slowly and opened the door just enough to slip inside, closing it carefully behind him so the latch engaged without sound. The service passage greeted him with a cool, stagnant stillness. The air smelled faintly of metal and old paint, the temperature several degrees lower than the gallery outside. The lighting was dim, each overhead fixture casting a narrow pool of pale light that left the spaces between them in shadow. Arman stood motionless for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust, listening for any movement beyond the faint ticking of distant pipes. Nothing stirred. He began walking slowly along the narrow corridor, his boots making almost no sound against the concrete floor. The passage curved gently after several meters, and as he rounded the bend, he noticed the first sign that someone else had been there recently.
A faint scuff marked the wall at shoulder height, as though someone had brushed against it in haste. A few steps farther, he saw a second mark on the floor, an irregular streak, lighter than the surrounding concrete, consistent with the sole of a shoe sliding abruptly. He knelt, examining the pattern. The size was small, consistent with a child's footwear, and the direction of the streak suggested forward motion, not retreat. The realization tightened something in his chest, not fear, but a sharpening of focus. A child had passed through here, and not calmly. He rose and continued, moving with greater caution now, scanning every surface, every corner where shadow gathered. The passage narrowed briefly near a junction where an old maintenance ladder stood folded against the wall, its metal frame casting angular shadows across the floor. One of the ladder's feet was slightly out of alignment, as if it had been bumped or shifted recently. Arman paused, studying it, then moved past, following the corridor toward the door that led to the private quarters. The farther he walked, the more the silence seemed to deepen, absorbing even the faint sounds of his own breathing. He became aware of the weight of the place, the sense that he was moving through a boundary not only physical, but procedural, each step carrying him farther beyond the protection of routine authority. Yet protocol also required the protection of vulnerable members of the household above all else, and that principle, though less precisely worded, carried equal weight. Arman placed his hand on the handle and paused, feeling the quiet pressure of responsibility settle into his chest. Then he turned the handle slowly and opened the door just enough to slip inside, closing it carefully behind him so the latch engaged without sound.
Arman remained crouched for several seconds, studying the torn strip of fabric on the floor, committing every detail to memory before touching anything. The fibers at the edge were stretched and frayed in a way that suggested sudden force rather than gradual wear, as if the cloth had caught against a rough surface while someone was moving quickly. He placed the fragment carefully into a small evidence sleeve from his belt kit and rose, continuing forward at a slower pace. The air in this section of the passage felt heavier, carrying a faint smell of dust disturbed from places rarely touched. Ahead, the corridor widened slightly near an alcove where old maintenance equipment was stored. The folded ladder he had noticed earlier stood there, but from this angle he could see more clearly that it was not resting flat against the wall. One side was shifted outward by several centimeters, enough to suggest it had been moved and then pushed back hastily. The concrete floor beneath it showed irregular marks where its feet had scraped, and beside those marks were smaller scuffs, uneven and erratic, consistent with quick, unsteady steps. Arman moved carefully around the ladder, scanning the floor and walls. A faint streak ran along the lower section of the wall, as though a sleeve or small shoulder had brushed against it while passing. He paused, listening again. The passage remained silent, the only sound the low hum of ventilation somewhere beyond the walls and the faint ticking of cooling pipes. The silence here was different from the quiet of the gallery. It felt enclosed, insulated, as if the outside world had receded completely. He advanced another few meters and saw the radiator mounted along the right wall, an older unit installed decades earlier and rarely used now that the palace climate system regulated temperature more precisely. Beneath it, partly concealed in shadow, lay a small object. Arman knelt and reached beneath the metal casing, drawing out a child's toy, a small carved figure, its paint slightly worn from use. He turned it in his gloved fingers, noting the faint scratches along one side, the kind made when an object was dropped or dragged along a hard surface. The presence of the toy confirmed what the glove and fabric had already suggested. A child had moved through this passage not long ago, and not calmly. He placed the toy carefully into another evidence sleeve and rose, his mind working through the implications. The private quarters lay only a short distance ahead, separated by a reinforced door that normally required coded access from both sides.
If someone had escorted a child through this passage, they would have needed authorization or the means to bypass it. Either possibility carried serious consequences. Arman stepped forward again, his movements controlled and deliberate, aware that every step might be altering evidence, yet also aware that delay could mean losing the opportunity to understand what had happened. Then he noticed something else on the floor ahead, a faint, irregular patch where dust had been disturbed more heavily than elsewhere, as if two or more people had paused there, shifting their weight, perhaps struggling before moving on. Arman stopped at the edge of the disturbed area, studying the pattern without stepping into it. The marks overlapped in a way that suggested more than one set of movements, larger scuffs consistent with adult footwear, and smaller, lighter impressions that aligned with the size of a child's shoes. The arrangement indicated not a brief pause, but several seconds of activity, perhaps longer. He could almost reconstruct the moment in his mind. Voices kept low but tense, hurried movements, the confined air of the passage amplifying every sound. Yet the silence now gave no trace of what had been said or done. He drew a slow breath and straightened, turning his attention toward the door at the end of the corridor. It remained closed, the indicator light above the access panel glowing steady amber, signifying that it had not been opened recently, or at least not through normal authorization. That detail unsettled him more than any of the physical evidence. If the door had not been opened through its access system, then whoever had passed through might have used an alternate route or a manual override known only to maintenance supervisors and certain senior staff. The situation had moved beyond irregularity into something that suggested planning and knowledge of restricted infrastructure. Arman reached for his radio, hesitating only a moment before activating a secure inner channel used for discreet coordination among senior guards. He kept his voice low, measured, providing only essential information. Signs of unauthorized movement in the service passage, evidence indicating the presence of a child, no immediate sign of current occupants. He requested that 2 members of the inner security unit quietly secure adjacent exits without triggering a general alert. The acknowledgement came back within seconds, calm and professional, and he felt a small measure of relief at no longer carrying the information alone. Still, the weight of responsibility remained. He had entered the passage without authorization, and now he was shaping the response to a situation whose full scope was still unknown. He moved closer to the door, examining the frame and hinges. Near the lower edge he found a faint scrape on the metal, fresh enough that the exposed surface had not yet dulled. Someone had forced or manipulated the door recently, though carefully enough to avoid triggering alarms. Arman rested his hand lightly against the cold surface, feeling the faint vibration of distant mechanical systems beyond it, and considered what might lie on the other side. The evidence behind him formed a silent testimony: the glove, the torn fabric, the toy, the disturbed floor. A child had been here, and whatever had happened had been concealed with deliberate care. As he withdrew his hand from the door, footsteps sounded faintly behind him in the passage, the controlled, measured steps of the inner security unit arriving, and Arman realized that the quiet investigation was about to give way to a search whose outcome could no longer be contained. The 2 members of the inner security unit approached without speaking, their movements deliberate, their expressions composed but attentive. Arman gave a brief, quiet summary, indicating the disturbed floor, the ladder, and the door bearing fresh scrape marks. They examined each detail in turn, careful not to disturb the evidence, their flashlights casting narrow beams across the concrete. The confined air of the passage seemed to tighten as the 3 of them stood in silence, each aware that the situation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer an isolated irregularity. It was a sequence of events pointing toward deliberate concealment and potential risk to a child within the palace itself.
One of the guards, Farouk, spoke softly, suggesting they extend the search toward the adjoining corridors before initiating any formal alert. Arman nodded, understanding the reasoning. A full lockdown would secure the area quickly, but would also draw immediate attention, spreading awareness of the incident far beyond those who needed to know. Discretion still mattered, particularly when a young member of the household might be involved. They began retracing the passage together, moving methodically, documenting each mark and object with quiet precision. When they reached the maintenance alcove, Arman noticed something he had not seen before: a faint thread of fabric caught on the edge of a protruding bolt near the ladder's hinge, matching the pale material of the torn strip he had collected earlier. It suggested that whoever had passed through here had done so in haste, brushing against obstacles without slowing. They continued toward the gallery door, emerging once more into the cool, controlled air of the exhibition corridor. The silence there felt different now, less like calm and more like suspension, as though the wing itself were waiting. Arman returned briefly to the control alcove, securing the evidence sleeves and reviewing the surveillance feeds again, this time expanding his search to corridors beyond the gallery. Minutes passed in concentrated silence until a faint knock sounded at the sealed entrance. A junior attendant stood outside, escorted by a guard who had been stationed in the outer corridor. Arman authorized entry. The attendant, pale and visibly unsettled, hesitated before speaking, glancing at the others as if uncertain whether to continue. Arman encouraged him quietly to report what he had seen. The attendant described noticing a young royal earlier that morning, walking quickly through a service corridor, accompanied by a staff member he did not recognize. The child had appeared frightened, moving with short, hurried steps, while the staff member kept a firm hold on the child's arm. The sight had seemed unusual, but not alarming enough at the time to report immediately. Only later, hearing that sections of the gallery were being quietly secured, had the attendant realized the significance. The statement settled over the room with a weight that made further hesitation impossible. Arman asked a few precise questions: time, location, direction of movement, and the attendant answered as clearly as he could. The route described aligned with the service passage and the missing 4 minutes in the surveillance record. More importantly, the mention of an unidentified staff member transformed suspicion into certainty that authority had been misused, or at least misrepresented, to move a vulnerable child through restricted space. Arman dismissed the attendant with instructions to remain available for follow-up, then turned to the 2 inner security officers. No one spoke for several seconds. The implications were now clear. A child had been escorted in distress by someone without proper authorization, evidence had been concealed, and the individual responsible might still be within the secured areas of the palace. Protocol required escalation to Central Command, but it also allowed a senior guard on scene to initiate a controlled containment when immediate risk to a vulnerable person was present. Arman felt the conflict rise once more. Not uncertainty this time, but the gravity of acting. A full alarm would seal the entire palace, disrupting operations and drawing attention that could complicate the search. A controlled lockdown, limited to the gallery wing and adjoining corridors, could contain the area quietly while allowing investigators to move without interference. He weighed the options quickly, measuring risk against time, and reached his decision. Taking the radio in his hand, he issued the order in a steady, even voice. All access points to the gallery wing and the connecting corridors were to be secured immediately under controlled lockdown procedures. Movement restricted to authorized security personnel only. Exits monitored, but not publicly announced. Acknowledgments came back in calm succession, each confirming the order was being carried out. Within minutes, the subtle shift began. Doors locking with muted clicks, guards repositioning with disciplined efficiency, communication channels narrowing to essential traffic.
The palace above continued its routines, unaware that a silent perimeter was forming beneath its surface. Arman stepped back into the corridor, listening to the faint echoes of movement as the search teams began to assemble. The stillness of the gallery returned, but it was no longer passive. It carried the focused tension of a place under watch. Somewhere within the secured areas, a frightened child and the person who had taken them remained unaccounted for. And as Arman stood in the cool light of the corridor, he understood that the search now beginning would not only determine the child's safety, but whether the trust that held the palace together had been quietly broken from within.